in a gentle introduction. So welcome everybody to today's webinar on achieving biodiversity net gain in practice. My name is Estelle Dehon KC. I'm a planning and environment barrister, amongst other things, at Cornerstone Barristers, member of Cornerstone Climate, where we look at things intersectionally, including biodiversity in relation to climate matters. And I'm delighted to be joined today by my two colleagues, Emmaline Lambert and Josef. And between the three of us, over the next hour or so, we're going to be looking at biodiversity net gain in practice. We will aim to leave at least 10 minutes for questions at the end. You'll see that the chat function is disabled, but that the Q&A function is very much enabled. So as things are going along, please do post your questions in the Q&A, and we will get through as many as we can at the end of the webinar. If there are lots of questions left over, then we'll see what we can do in terms of providing some answers when we give you the recording of this webinar. Please note that the webinar is currently being recorded. It will be sent to you with any further answers shortly after the end of the session, either today or tomorrow. So let me just kick off with a general introduction, which is the observation that this is a timely webinar. You may have seen that last night the 2023 updated State of Nature report was published. And this updates the quite significant State of Nature report by a number of nature organizations a few years ago. And it reinforces the key message about the significant decline in species abundance in the UK since 1970. Really, birds are one of the key areas where there's a lot of significant concern, but you'll see that there's concern around decline in amphibians and reptiles, decline in fungi and lichen. The report, for the most part, makes pretty grim reading, but there is an emphasis on the fact that we have the tools to turn this decline in nature around, precipitous though it may have been, and that we know what has to happen to work to protect landscapes for the benefit of people, nature, and the climate. And one of the tools that is in this armory is biodiversity net gain. So I'm going to hand over now to Emmaline to get us into the topic and update us with all the delicious stuff that has happened over the last 24 hours. Over to you, Emmaline.
Thanks, Estelle, and good morning, everybody. I'll be covering an introduction to biodiversity net gain. What is it? How local authorities can require it, high-level legal framework, progress towards secondary legislation, when it will be mandatory, and to what it will apply in practice. Next slide. Thanks, Estelle. That's a lovely picture. Next slide. First of all, what is the current situation and why is this needed? Building on what Estelle has just been talking about, currently there is no minimum legal requirement for biodiversity net gain. Section 40 of the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act 2006 was recently amended so that the duty on public authorities is now conservation and enhancement of biodiversity, previously just conservation. Paragraph 174 of the NPPF provides that planning policies and decisions should contribute to and enhance the natural and local environment by minimising impacts on and providing net gains for biodiversity. And paragraph 179 provides for pursuing opportunities for securing measurable net gains for biodiversity. But in practice, this is interpreted to a low threshold by some inspectors at planning appeals, especially where there's no local development plan policy requiring a minimum percentage. And I provide a quotation from an appeal decision in which the inspector essentially said that a 1% gain is sufficient to meet national planning policy. Next slide, please. There have been huge biodiversity losses over recent years globally. Urbanisation, including development such as housing, is a key cause of decline in biodiversity. Therefore, the changes proposed will require developers to consider how biodiversity net gain can be provided early on in the process And the Environment Act 2021 is described by Natural England as a significant step in setting out clear targets and direction in environmental legislation for nature recovery, and labels the mandatory biodiversity net gain as key. Next slide. So what is biodiversity net gain? Well, Natural England defines the concept as an approach to terrestrial development and/or land management that aims to leave the natural environment in a measurably better state. The passing of the Environment Act 2021 will make it, amongst other obligations, a requirement for all appropriate developments to deliver a minimum 10% net gain in biodiversity. Schedule A, Part 1, Para 2 defines the biodiversity gain objective as being met in relation to development for which planning permission is granted if the biodiversity value attributable to the development exceeds the pre-development biodiversity value of the on-site habitat by at least the relevant percentage. And we know the relevant percentage is defined as 10%, and the Act does provide for that relevant percentage to be amended by regulations by the Secretary of State. So 10% is a minimum, but some local authorities are looking to set higher requirements in local plans. That's for the local plans that are pressing ahead at the moment. Planning Resource reported in April this year that there were 14 local authorities whose local plans would require greater than a 10% biodiversity net gain. Dr. Nick White from Natural England advised in the summer that councils doing so should have robust local evidence. Clearly, the viability of requiring more than 10% will need to have been tested. The Guildford Borough Local Plan was adopted in March this year and requires 20% once biodiversity net gain becomes mandatory. This was recommended by Surrey Nature Partnership, and the policy was tested through a viability assessment. The Kent Nature Partnership has published a county-wide strategic viability assessment to understand the implications for a 20% approach for Kent. And it found, interestingly, that the biggest cost in most cases is to get to the mandatory minimum of 10%. And to increase to 15 or 20% in most cases costs much less and is generally negligible. A survey in April this year found that more than 40% of all local planning authorities have specific biodiversity net gain policies in their adopted or emerging local plans. That's up from 28% the year before, so definite progress being made there. Next slide. The Environment Act framework. Well, in order to implement the measures in relation to biodiversity net gain set out in the Environment Act, secondary legislation is required, which will define how net gain will function, where exemptions will be provided, and how monitoring can be secured. We know as of yesterday that the secondary legislation is now delayed. However, for the moment, the Environment Act sets out the following key components for mandatory biodiversity net gain. It amends the Town and Country Planning Act. It provides for a minimum 10% gain required calculated using the biodiversity metric and approval of a biodiversity gain plan. Habitat secured for at least 30 years via planning obligations or conservation covenants, and it can be delivered on-site, off-site, or via a new statutory biodiversity credits scheme. Next slide. Key to the implementation of biodiversity net gain is a new standard pre-commencement condition relating to biodiversity gain to secure biodiversity net gain on developments, which is the general condition of planning permission. It will require a biodiversity gain plan to be submitted for approval, and Part 2 of Schedule 14 sets out the matters to which the plan is to refer. But in short, every planning permission, save for exceptions, granted for the development of land in England shall be deemed to have been granted subject to the condition. Next slide, please. The biodiversity gain plan should cover how adverse impacts on habitats have been minimised, the pre-development biodiversity value of the on-site habitat, the post-development biodiversity value of the on-site habitat, the biodiversity value of any off-site habitat provided in relation to the development, any statutory biodiversity credits purchased, plus any further requirements that may be set out in secondary legislation. The local planning authority must approve the plan only if it's satisfied that certain required matters are met, such as that the post-development biodiversity value of the on-site habitat is at least the value specified in the plan. In line with the mitigation hierarchy, off-site mitigation should only be used where impacts cannot be avoided, minimised, or where on-site gains cannot be achieved. Off-site provision will be encouraged to be local, and that's expected to be achieved via policies and guidance. There will be further guidance on decision-making for on-site and local off-site mitigation and the circumstances developers would be able to look for outside the local area. In order to avoid unreasonable delays between the ecological impact and the off-site compensation being delivered, it is proposed that no more than 12 months should be allowed after discharge of the mandatory pre-commencement condition. So what progress towards the secondary legislation has been made? Well, we had hoped that the regulations would have been out for consultation or even better have been made. That hasn't happened yet, and Estelle will update later further on that. Next slide, please. In the meantime, Defra launched a consultation on the Biodiversity Net Gain regulations on the 11th of January 2022. It closed on the 5th of April 2022. Its overview provided, we want to know what you think about how biodiversity net gain will work in practice. The government response was long awaited and was finally published in February this year, almost a year after the consultation closed. The consultation was to guide crucial secondary legislation and was split into 3 sections, asking for opinions. I've set out on this slide what the consultation covered. It was wide-ranging and included exemptions, the definition of irreplaceable habitat and whether it should be excluded, and how biodiversity net gain will be implemented, including evaluation and monitoring. Next slide, please. The response from government has led to updated guidance, and there is some further clarity, although more needs to come, and a key refrain of the responses will be dealt with through secondary legislation and guidance, so more coming. When is biodiversity net gain mandatory? Well, despite the news early yesterday, there was later in the day a press release from Defra and the Department for Levelling Up, confirming that upcoming legislation to bring in these rules will be laid in November. The press release said that the mandatory requirement will be effective from January 2024. For small sites, it's still expected to be April 2024, and for nationally significant infrastructure projects, it's planned for 2025. The press release says that by the end of November, there will be regulations and guidance for the statutory biodiversity metric, for the draft biodiversity gain plan template, the habitat management and monitoring plan template, and a package of guidance that sets out further advice for landowners, developers, and local planning authorities. So there was some comfort in the later press release yesterday that this is not being kicked into the long grass, and that regulations and guidance are coming, and that the mandatory biodiversity net gain is also coming. Turning to the application of the requirement in practice, first of all, exemptions. Whenever the start date is, there will be exemptions to the mandatory requirement. The Environment Act 2021 already makes exemptions for permitted development and urgent crown development. The biodiversity metric allows for temporary impacts that can be restored within 2 years to be excluded from calculations, and gives existing sealed surfaces a 0 score, meaning they are exempted. The response says that the government intends to use regulations to make exemptions for development impacting habitat of an area below a de minimis threshold of 25 metres squared or 5 metres for linear habitats such as hedgerows and watercourses, householder applications, biodiversity gain sites, and small-scale self-build and custom house building. Just on the de minimis threshold, That applies to the area or length of habitat within a development, not the total development footprint. And the same exemption will apply for small sites. If a development contains less than 25 meters squared of non-priority habitat, but 5 meters or more of linear habitat, or vice versa, then the exemption will not apply and all habitats would be subject to biodiversity net gain. But if the exemption does apply, then there's no requirement to deliver biodiversity net gain on that site. Irreplaceable habitat. Unfortunately, the definition is still unknown, but we are told there will be further consultation on the definition. What we do know is that secondary legislation will disapply the 10% net gain requirement for irreplaceable habitat and apply separate requirements to be used by the local planning authority when determining planning applications. On small sites are kept within the scope of biodiversity net gain. The definition for the purpose of the biodiversity net gain exemption is set out on this slide. Essentially, it relates to, for residential development, to the number of dwellings and or the site area, or for non-residential development, the floor space or site area. Some options are being explored in relation to small sites to reduce the burden. For example, a simplified metric for smaller sites, and Natural England released a version earlier this year. And also things like ensuring that the biodiversity unit allocation and statutory biodiversity credit sales mechanisms can be used with small volumes. More to come on that. For outline and phase permissions, additional information will need to be provided to local planning authorities, setting out how biodiversity gain will be achieved across the whole development site. So that is across all phases. Prior to the commencement of each phase of the development, a new plan will be required, and the response sets out that such development should be subject to a condition which requires approval of a biodiversity gain plan prior to the commencement of each phase. It's clear that the preference or expectation will be that works will be required for each phase, no inflexible front loading requirements requiring the bulk of biodiversity works in early phases, and it's envisaged that local planning authorities will be given discretion in this respect. But again, details will be through secondary legislation and guidance to clarify and formalise processes. In relation to variations of planning permissions, it had been a concern that future planning permission variations granted after the relevant date would impose biodiversity net gain requirements, even if the original scheme had no such requirement. It's been confirmed that such variations will only be subject to the mandatory requirement where the original permission was granted after biodiversity net gain became mandatory. So a Section 73 application that results in a change to the post-development biodiversity value will require an updated biodiversity gain plan with the original pre-development baseline applying. Again, guidance to be provided. And lastly, on the application, nationally strategic infrastructure projects will be expected to provide biodiversity net gain. And we know this is often happening voluntarily already, but permitted development will not. And change of use schemes are in scope and will be subject to biodiversity net gain. So that deals with the high level overview, and I'm now handing over to Jo.
Thanks, Emmaline. I think Will is just going to change the settings so that you can see my face rather than Emmeline's face, and I'll just wait for him to do that. Thanks for that, Emmaline. That's a really good whistle-stop tour of how this is all going to work, or at least how the bits that we know about are going to work. I'm just going to do a bit of a deep dive into the sort of practical application of some of what Emmeline's just set out, really focusing on calculating and then delivering BNG on sites. Now, necessarily some of this will be a bit high level because we don't have the full guidance detail, etc. But hopefully it will be helpful. Next slide, please, Estelle. It's really all about the matrix. I mean the metric. So the whole calculation of biodiversity net gain is dependent on a metric which has been developed. We're on version 4 at the moment, developed by a group of very clever ecologists and so on to essentially produce a way of scoring land in respect of its biodiversity and its biodiversity quality, effectively. And everything about calculating BNG really comes back to the metric. Next slide, please, Estelle. Where it works. The process in a nutshell is this, and I'm sure this will be known to the vast majority of you, but worth just reminding ourselves that essentially when we talk about 10% biodiversity net gain, or indeed any biodiversity net gain, what we're looking at is the difference between what is called the pre-development biodiversity value, that's number one, and the post-development biodiversity value. So what's the difference between the land pre and post-development? Obvious. Now, there's a deliberate mistake on this slide, which I spotted moments ago, texted Estelle, but it was too late to change. And it's at number 4. You can all see it. I say there that number 1 must be at least 10% better than number 2, but that would be biodiversity net loss. So we don't want that. That's not what that means. It should be the other way around. Number 2, post-development biodiversity value, must be at least 10% better than number 1, pre-development biodiversity value. And in terms of measuring that, when we send you these slides, I'll correct that. In terms of measuring that, at the heart of the metric is this idea of biodiversity units. Now, I'm going to talk about biodiversity credits later because they're different, but units are, if you like, the currency of the metric, and they're really divided into 3 kinds: area units, hedgerow units, and watercourse units, and they have a slightly different way of calculating value. But taken together, what they produce is a score, really, for land. And using that score, you can come up with a total score pre-development and then compare it to a total score post-development, which obviously will be prospective calculation. And the question is number 2 better than number 1? So that's how this works. That's the mechanism. Estelle's preempted me and gone on. What this is really is a hierarchy of value, or what it contains is a hierarchy of value. Now, lots of the rhetoric around biodiversity net gain says that on-site will be preferred to off-site and local preferred to further away, and so on. And the metric provides for this in this way. In calculating the units, the biodiversity unit score, there's a particular, it's not an algorithm, but that's the fashionable word. There's a particular way of assigning more value to an enhanced unit on site than to doing so off site. And indeed, the further away the unit that's being enhanced is from the site, the lower the relative score compared to if it was right next door. So you've got this hierarchy within the metric in terms of the value that you get for your biodiversity enhancements, which has the highest value for the same enhancement, the highest value if it's delivered on site, and then a diminishing value for it as it goes off site, further away. And then at the bottom end are these, what I said a moment ago, are called credits, which I'll come to in a moment. And that's the last resort. If a developer really can't deliver biodiversity gains on site or even off site, then there is a kind of last resort, which the guidance is saying in order to stop biodiversity net gain stymieing development. It's a bit of that idea of, well, if you really can't improve biodiversity anywhere, we'll let you pay. But I'll come on to that in a minute. I feel quite skeptical about that. I think it's quite cynical, but anyway, I'll come on to that. Next slides, please, Estelle. So I want to look first of all at this idea of pre-development biodiversity value, because this is crucial. Any process in which you calculate an improvement to something, which is what we're talking about here, relies extremely heavily on the baseline, what the present situation is, i.e. the pre-development situation. And so it's absolutely crucial to get that right and to understand it. So I'm just going to home in on that. Next slide, please, Estelle. This all revolves around the idea of the relevant date. So when do you have to assess the pre-development biodiversity value? Now, this is all in Schedule 14 of the Act, and so in due course will be in the Town and Country Planning Act. And in short, what Schedule 14 says about pre-development biodiversity value is that it's to be measured at the relevant date. And the relevant date is in I think probably the vast majority of cases, the date of the application for planning permission. So that's the primary answer. You assess the pre-development biodiversity value at the date of the application for planning permission. If it's a proposal or a set of proposals that doesn't require an application, so for example, local development order or simplified planning zones or one of those things, then it's the date of planning permission. But actually the requirements as to biodiversity net gain 10% doesn't come in for those kinds of schemes straight away anyway, so you don't really need to worry about those yet. They're coming further down the line, but when they do, obviously there's no application in those cases and it's the date of planning permission. The third option is that the landowner and the local authority can agree an earlier date than the application for planning permission if they wish to. And I think one of the reasons for allowing that, although it can't be earlier than the first date in which this all comes into force, I think the idea for that is that what you don't want to do is discourage landowners from improving biodiversity immediately on their land for fear of increasing the pre-development biodiversity net gain and thereby stymieing their chances of getting to 10%. So I think that's the idea behind the ability to agree an earlier date. And then there's the possibility of it being the 30th of January 2020, and there's an asterisk after that because actually it probably won't be that date, but I'll explain what I mean in a minute with reference to the next slide. And this is a provision in Schedule 14, which is intended to be a safeguard against unscrupulous landowners seeing what was coming down the line and basically spoiling their land in order to reduce or lower their pre-development biodiversity score. And you could see that if you were an unscrupulous developer, you might think, well, look, if we remove all of these species from our land and depress the biodiversity value now, then all we'll have to do then is add 10% to something lower and we can get over the threshold. Well, in order to stop that happening, whether that was going to happen or not, I don't know, I don't express a view. So Schedule 14 says that where certain conditions are met, and I'll show you what those are in a minute, then the relevant date can be as far back as the 30th of January 2020, which is the date that the bill was introduced to Parliament. So the date that everyone can be deemed to know that at some point coming down the line, there's going to be this requirement to score a biodiversity net gain. So next slide shows us what those conditions are. The way the safeguard works is to say that if a person, footnote unscrupulous landowner, carries on activities on land on or after the 30th of January, so after the bill is introduced to Parliament, other than with planning permission, which obviously doesn't bite, and as a result of the activities, the biodiversity value of the on-site habitat is lower on the relevant date, i.e. the application for planning permission, than it would otherwise have been, i.e. if a landowner takes an axe to the trees on his or her land, then the pre-development biodiversity value of the on-site habitat is to be taken to be its value immediately before they started chopping down the trees. And that could be as early as 30th of January 2020. Now, in reality, it's going to be, in most cases, a date later than that, unless they went out and chopped down trees on the 1st of February 2020, or indeed even the 30th of January, saw the bill, got out their axe and went off. But what this is a straightforward safeguard against landowners having lowered the biodiversity value of their land other than by planning permission in order to increase their chances of securing an increase with their development. So you can see how that works. Okay, next slide, please. Another point to note. This is the point about biodiversity units. As I said a few moments ago, they're really split into three, but what I'm not going to do today is deep dive into the way the metric works. That's a whole other seminar of its own and would take far too long this morning to do that. But just to home in on that, next slide, please, Estelle. I know you're excited about this next slide. This is about adding value to biodiversity being delivered locally, biodiversity improvement being delivered locally rather than remotely. Next slide. I think there's only so much we can see of. Oh, there she is again. Now, as I said earlier, the metric works by way of a hierarchy of value in geographical terms. So the closer to the site, to the proposals that the biodiversity net gain measures are being delivered, the more valuable they are. So exactly the same biodiversity improvement on site is worth more in the metric than it would be if it was 25 miles away. I've chosen 25 miles. I actually don't know if that's true, but further away, And the algorithm is called the spatial risk multiplier. That's what delivers that additional value in that case. And what the government says about this is it's an incentive-based approach to biodiversity net gain, to encourage landowners to follow the mitigation hierarchy, essentially, that you'd be better off delivering this on-site. If you can't deliver it on-site, you should deliver it off-site but nearby. If you can't deliver it off-site and nearby, you should deliver it off-site somewhere. And then eventually, as I'll come on to in a minute, if you can't do any of those things, then you can buy some credits from the government, who will do something at some point in some other place. Now, the last bullet point on this slide said, is that sufficient? And I just want to say a couple of things about that. First of all, one of the issues that I think arises with this approach to biodiversity net gain is that there is a sort of logical outcome here, that if you can deliver biodiversity net gain somewhere else, then what you might end up with is areas of the country where lots and lots of biodiversity net gain is being delivered, so much better biodiversity in certain areas, at the cost of biodiversity in other areas. And I think ultimately that has a slightly worrying implication in terms of land values, and also in terms of what kind of development is happening and where, how much development. What I mean in stark and simple terms, I don't think this is really going to happen, is that if you can offset a reduction in biodiversity on housing sites in the southeast, where the vast majority of houses are desired and I think built, by improving habitats in, for the sake of argument, Scotland or the north of England, then the sort of end game is that we end up with a biodiversity improvement up there at the cost of a biodiversity downgrade in popular places for house building and whatever else. And I think that's problematic. Now, is this incentive-based approach enough? I suspect it won't be. And the reason I say that is that leaving it to questions of land value is problematic. If you can afford to pay for your biodiversity net gain, that's going to depend to some extent on where you are in the country, because land values depend on where you are in the country, and also on the kind of development that you're doing, and all sorts of things like that. So I think that local policy will need to step in and add a further layer of protection to try and ensure that in all but the rarest of cases, biodiversity net gain is actually delivered, well, first of all, on site, but if it really can't be delivered on site, then off site. I think one of the other problems coming down the line is, how do local authorities deal with the suggestion from the developers that they can't deliver on-site biodiversity net gain? Now, to take an obvious example, if you've got a scheme for 100 houses, the argument might be, well, we can't deliver on-site biodiversity net gain because there's no space. You know, we need all the space for houses. To which the answer might come, well, what about if you only built 70 houses and did it? So I think the question of whether you can or can't deliver biodiversity net gain on site is going to be one to really think very carefully about. And I am skeptical, as you can probably gather, about the spatial risk multiplier and whether this incentive-based approach is enough. I know that lots of local authorities are already thinking about prioritising, producing local policy which prioritises on-site and hyper-local biodiversity net gain. And just to illustrate this, I did a case recently where the suggestion was in the section 106 of a biodiversity net gain of 10%. There was no controversy about that, but the way the section 106 worked was to propose nearby off-site. They said they couldn't do on-site BNG, but they proposed off-site BNG in the district, and if that was not possible in the county, and if that was not possible nationally, and one of the questions which didn't really get resolved actually in the event was, what does it mean to not be possible to do that? I think that's going to be one of the questions that arises. Okay, next slide, please. That's enough of the League of Gentlemen. Let's go to Gordon Gekko. So off-site biodiversity net gain delivery, the suggestion in all the guidance is that this will be done or might be done by habitat banks, which could be run by local planning authorities or could be run by landowners. In effect, these are areas of land that that work is done to improve biodiversity pre and unconnected to development, and then those improvements are sold essentially as credits or as units to landowners somewhere else who want to achieve 10%, can't do it on site, and say they want to do it off site. Now, the guidance and all the responses to consultation says that local planning authorities are able to do this. They can buy the land and improve it and then sell it. But what they can't do is direct landowners to their own habitat bank ahead of others. So you can't prefer your own if you're a local authority, but you can join the market, as it were. Now, the other thing that causes me a bit of concern is the idea that is currently at play, which is that any gains over 10% can then be traded as credit. So one developer could buy from another developer who's delivered 20% biodiversity net gain, could buy the excess 10% for their own authority, net effect 10% net gain across 2 sites. My view is if this comes to pass, it's a missed opportunity. And I also think it throws up a couple of problems. One of the things, the reason I think it's a missed opportunity is that what it looks to really is an overall maximum 10% net gain, which I think is unambitious. But the second thing that causes me concern is how will this work? I did a case recently where it was a greenbelt case, and one of the main benefits in the very special circumstances offer was a 234% biodiversity net gain. The developer in that case was going to create a very large countryside park on a degraded habitat and improve it. It was an excellent offer. They got planning permission for it. But one of the reasons that they got planning permission was that it was part of the very special circumstances case that they would deliver this massive over delivery of biodiversity net gain. Now, how does that work if they can then sell the credits of having done so to other developers and essentially chip away at the 234%? Not for a minute suggesting they're going to, but in this market, I wonder how that then fits with gaining planning permission. Emily mentioned Guildford, who are requiring 20%, but that seems to me to offer the possibility that everyone delivering 20% as per Guildford's policy might also then be able to sell the additional 10% ex post facto to other developers in order to get them up to 20%, which I think is problematic. I don't really know how this is going to be sorted. And then the last point about this trading idea is that there's going to be a biodiversity gain site register set up, which keeps a record of all of these off-site mitigation areas and allows for, or will allow for, public monitoring of whether BNG is in fact being delivered at the rate proposed on those off-site sites. Now, we don't know yet quite what the requirements for getting on that register are going to be. I think they're going to be published later, but that's going to be, or is intended to be, a way of remaining or keeping off-site BNG delivery accountable. Okay, next slide, Estelle, please. Credits, last in the hierarchy. And remember I said earlier that these are not to be confused with biodiversity units, which are at the heart of the matrix, the metric. They are essentially government sold credits, and the idea is that they'll be sold at a higher price than it could be to achieve units in any other way. So as a matter of last resort, if you really can't deliver either on-site or off-site biodiversity net gain, then you can buy a credit from the government, and it's said the government will deliver gains somewhere else. We don't really know where, and again, I suspect it will be more detail to come, as Emmaline said in every other one of her slides. But again, all the language is that this is going to be very much a last resort, and if you really can't, whatever can't means, if you really can't deliver biodiversity net gain in any other way, then this will be a way of unlocking your development. You can pay essentially an extortionate fee compared to other ways of delivering in order to get you over the hurdle. And again, the question will arise, what does it mean to not be able to do that? And then lastly, delivery. And I've touched on this a little bit. Next slide, please, Estelle. Next and last for my bit. Obviously, even now, biodiversity net gain is being delivered by Section 106. It's 10% plus is being delivered across the country in order to produce a benefit in planning terms, or even a contribution to a very special circumstances case. And Section 106 is the primary way of doing that. Obviously, there's the condition about the plan as well, but those measures in the plan will need to be secured, and the way to do that in most cases, I suspect, will be Section 106. There's also something called a conservation covenant, which is an alternative to Section 106, although has a similar effect, which is an ability to contract privately with a provider, and they're called responsible bodies. You can apply to be a responsible body, and you have to, in order to qualify as a responsible body, you have to have some connection with kind of improving biodiversity and the environment. Local authorities can and I suspect will apply. And a conservation covenant runs with the land in the same way as the Section 106 obligation does. So even if the developer then sells the land to somebody else, the requirements of the covenant will follow with the land. The rest of the points on this slide are really just questions. I don't have answers to them. How will it be secured if you're offering biodiversity net gain on an off-site area as part of a habitat bank or something? Some thought will need to be given about how that's achieved in a Section 106. You're essentially binding the land of somebody else, that they might well have to be signatories to the Section 106. Some thought will need to be given to making sure that that gets secured. Financing and monitoring, the same. Will Section 106s provide for, as they do presently for kind of travel plans, will they provide for monitoring fees and so on to ensure that this 30-year time frame for biodiversity net gain can actually be secured and monitored over that whole time? Obviously, the register will help with that once it's set up in terms of accountability and keeping track, but one wonders where the funding for all of that will come. And the government is clear at the moment that responsibility for all this will fall to local authority enforcement departments, which we know are massively over-resourced and are mainly hanging around doing nothing, twiddling their thumbs, waiting for something to happen. So they'll be delighted to have something to do, right? That's my bit. Estelle, I think it's now over to you to bring it home, as they say.
Yes, thanks very much. So just over to me now for some final observations. And the first one that I make is that this is really a very interesting and significant set of opportunities. And one of the key areas where Defra guidance, which came out a few months ago, and I recommend to you, has given us some clarity, is that sites will be allowed to stack their environmental benefits, but so long as those are benefits in relation to land management. So, for example, a single site could provide biodiversity net gain, it could address nutrient neutrality, if it falls within the environmental land management scheme in relation to agriculture, it could be providing all three of those public goods at the same time. But what the guidance identifies is that carbon credits will be excluded from that. People thought that was interesting. I see that because there can sometimes be a contradiction or a tension between certain types of land management that provide environmental benefits and carbon credits. Obviously, sometimes they work together as well. But given that there are two crises ongoing at the same time that interlink in relation to climate and biodiversity, it certainly is initially, I think, sensible to try and get the most in relation to addressing both of those, and keeping carbon credits separate does that to a certain extent. There was a question in relation to what we know at the moment about pricing. And the best that I can do answering that is that we certainly know something about the statutory pricing, and we know a little bit about the market pricing at the moment. So Defra published, I think last month, a provisional set of pricing tiers. And as far as I can tell, across different markets and different elements within markets, developers, farmers, and others, that was pretty well responded to, because it did a few things. The first thing it did is that it showed that for the statutory level, i.e. that element of last resort, the cost would be significant. It would be significant and it would be high. And there was a little bit of a surprising sting in that the cost was given and then 2 credits need to be bought for each biodiversity net gain unit. So if you were just looking at the lowest level, so low level habitat of £42,000, you would have to double that to get your one biodiversity net gain unit. Going up to high distinctiveness, it was very expensive. And for lakes, it was very, very, very expensive. That would operate in two different ways. First, disincentivize reliance on the statutory last resort, and also not stifle the commercial market, because there is a burgeoning commercial market in these types of credits. And at the moment, the market's offering, for example, £30,000 for low-level habitat. So the statutory element wouldn't undercut that. And this leads on to something else that I'll say in terms of final things. I'll just get to the last bubble there. We are looking at quite an exciting potential for corporate natural capital markets to develop. And this ties in not just with Biodiversity Net Gain, but with a number of environmental improvement schemes, and also with what's coming down the line now in relation to voluntary the nature obligations for disclosure. So the task force for natural financial related disclosures, voluntary at the moment, but may go the same way as the climate or carbon related one, which is becoming mandatory for certain organizations. And we know that ESG is becoming much more important in many areas, and this ties in with that as well. But as with any market, regulation of the market, monitoring of the market, and ensuring the market is working optimally rather than having adverse or odd reactions will be key to the outcome. We saw from Emmaline's slide earlier that the Biodiversity Net Gain regs are going to go through Parliament in November. I suppose the no further consultation bubble should have a question there. It may well be that that is in order to give some final aspects of consultation once the regulations are published. We don't know when that will be. It may not be, we just don't know. The Natural England update bubble that was there before the updates from yesterday, just to say that it came to me via the grapevine that Natural England had stated 3 or 4 days ago that the regulations were in draft, had been drafted, and so were existing in the world. And then what appears to have happened is a recognition that making the scheme operate from the date that was anticipated wouldn't work. We don't know, though, as I say, whether the pushing back of the schedule is to allow for consultation on those regulations or not. And then the final thing that obviously is going to happen and need to happen is for upskilling. Upskilling everywhere, in particular upskilling for local planning authorities. And I just want to mention in that regard a resource, the Planning Advisory Service through the local gov website published a really excellent set of FAQs last month. And a number of those addressed the need for upskilling within local authorities, where there might be some money coming for that, and what type of skills local authorities might need to develop in order to make the best of and address these requirements down the line. So that is a resource that is available, and for those of you in local authorities on the call, I recommend it to you. So with an eye on the time, we've got 10 minutes left. There's lots of interesting questions that have come in. I'll invite Emmaline and Joe back onto the screen. We've answered a few of the questions in writing, but I'll start off with some of them as they've come in, and then we'll see, jumping around, how we get through the questions. The first question that came in, though, I'll leave over to Emmaline. So if I can invite you to read and answer that question.
Thanks, Estelle. So someone has said they undertake a lot of change of use work in high street retail units. These applications, which usually relate to a single retail unit with no external space, will be subject to BNG according to my presentation. Is that correct? So following on from me setting out that change of use applications are in scope for Biodiversity Net Gain, the answer is yes, change of use schemes are in scope. However, the exemptions might apply. So it's likely that it could be out of scope if it's a small site, and it sounds from what you're saying that it could well be. And also remember, permitted development not in scope, so it depends on the type of change of use also. Hope that helps.
Super, thanks very much. I'm just scrolling down to have a look at some of the later questions, and I'll pick up quickly an interesting one and then come back to you, Emmaline, for another one. So there's a question down towards the bottom from Helen about stacking and whether we think BNG and SANG provision might be provided on the same land. I mean, I would have thought so, subject to regulation telling us otherwise. That seems to be the sort of stacking that, according to the Defra guidance, would work well. So I would hope that the answer to that is yes. Emmaline, I'll come back to you quickly and then I'll go over to Joe for a question. Alex Munro, in his first question, sent an interesting question about the further from the site you provide BNG, the greater area of land might need to be enhanced. Is that right?
I think the answer is, I'm afraid, we don't really know the specifics. It may be that a greater area of land is required, but it may not be. It could be a smaller area of land, but with really great enhancements. I think that local policies will probably fill in some of these gaps as to what will be required for off-site mitigation also. But I think the bottom line is not necessarily, and we don't really know yet.
Yeah, I think, can I just jump in on that?
Please.
I think the answer, as Emmaline says, it's not linear. I mean, I think what you can say is that if you're providing biodiversity net gain further away, you're going to have to do more. Now, whether that's provide more land, or as Emmaline says, provide more intense improvements on the same area of land or even a smaller area of land, I think will depend entirely on how the metric assesses what exactly it is that you're proposing and what you're going to do. But clearly, in some cases, you're going to be providing a greater area of land to provide enhancements on because you have to be further away. But I think it's a bit more nuanced than that, as Emmaline says. Can I just jump in on another couple of the questions? Were you going to dish one out to me, Estelle? Or
no, I was going to invite you to choose from the smorgasbord of delights.
Phew, that's a relief. So David Adeyemi-Ebere, I mean, I agree with you. You probably gathered from what I was saying that this idea of trading credits worries me. I mean, we did that with carbon offsetting, didn't we? And we see what happened with that. It basically meant that nothing happened. And as you say, even these days, you can pay to drive into the ULEZ zone or the congestion zone. So you can escape the effect by paying. And I think that does have worrying sort of social implications. And in a sense, that was what I was trying to sort of touch on a bit by this idea of what it will mean if you can't, or what it will mean to say, I can't provide biodiversity net gain on site. You know, that will depend on land values, on viability, on your financial resources, you know, on the value of the development you're proposing. Obviously, we know that at the moment, you know, housing provides probably the greatest return and more than other kinds of development. So will that mean a different approach to housing sites? You know, at what point will we be saying, well, actually, you need to deliver fewer houses in order to achieve a better degree of biodiversity net gain on site? So in a sense, I share your concern about the idea of trading excess credits. Instead, you usually got a view about these sorts of things.
Yeah. So I think that there were a lot of people and people across kind of the whole piece who were a bit disappointed that any excess above 10% would be able to be traded in that way. And so that was, as you said, Joe, a lost opportunity. But there is a certain level of concern about it being very difficult for there to be on-site improvement in most circumstances. And so we're just going to fall back on what seems to be an easier option. I'm a slight optimist in that I think actually there is a great opportunity for this to work well. And I do actually think the same thing about carbon credits. I think that if the market operates well and if there's good regulation and sensible oversight, I think it could operate very effectively. My concern is that good regulation is difficult and takes a lot of thought and care, and we haven't necessarily been seeing that, although, you know, we might be surprised. Emmaline, we indicated that we'd answer Kenya's first question live. So do you want to take that one about local plans considering pre-development BNG value?
Yeah, so what interestingly Kenya says is that there are already examples of sites not providing allocated housing numbers because of biodiversity net gain, which is disappointing. I mentioned viability assessments earlier. I do think there will need to be significant work undertaken up front as part of the evidence base for local plans in relation to allocations. So viability assessments and possibly other types of assessment to ensure that allocated sites can deliver housing numbers and biodiversity net gain alongside. Again, remember that the mitigation hierarchy could apply even if the biodiversity net gain can't be delivered on site because of the housing numbers. Viability assessments should ensure that biodiversity net gain could be delivered off site. But yes, the answer is yes, I think it will need to be considered upfront more.
All right, super, thank you. Lots of luscious questions. I'll take one, and then Joe, I'll give you the last opportunity, and then the others that we don't get to, apologies, we'll do our best to answer in writing. I'll pick up Grace Pino's question, which is about how local authorities can be confident that BNG will be delivered over the 30-year period, and might commuted sums be a way forward to ensure that funds are earmarked for maintenance and monitoring. I mean, you've absolutely put your finger on the nub of one of the great difficulties, which is the achievement over the 30-year period is going to be possibly one of the greatest of the challenges. And I definitely think that commuted sums might be a way forward. I think there's going to be a kind of, or at least I hope that there's going to be a burgeoning of really interesting mechanisms that will run with the land, that will find ways to ensure that at least some monitoring is taking place. And commuted sums is certainly one thing that I've been hearing talking about quite a bit, and I am quite optimistic that they would be a way forward. Joe, any final thoughts on any of the questions?
Yeah, I thought I'd just return to this idea of the relevant date and the safeguard against unscrupulous landowners doing things. One of the questions was who's going to have to prove that the kind of environmental degradation had been done, and on what standard of proof, and how would that be played out, which I think is an interesting question. The Environment Act doesn't provide an answer to that. I mean, I think primarily it will be a question of negotiation. You know, the plan will be presented as part of an application. The local authority will, for whatever reason, have some skepticism about the pre-development biodiversity value and will push back, and there will be a period of negotiation. Ultimately, I think if the local authority is completely unconvinced that there hasn't been environmental degradation and the relevant date should be much earlier, then I think ultimately they'll refuse planning permission or require something by way of condition, and it will be dealt with by a planning appeal. Now that, you know, how that will play out, we don't know, but I think it's an interesting question. Again, Estelle, Emmaline may have their own views, and I'm really just shooting from the hip. I haven't thought about this, but I think there isn't a direct answer. It will, I'm afraid, fall on either enforcement officers or the planning department more generally to provide the evidence of that happening, and that's not straightforward because, you know, as you know, enforcement is complaint-led. One doesn't always know. One might have a suspicion. Of course, if the trees are already down, I mean, it's not always trees, but if the trees are already down, well, it's quite difficult to ascertain, particularly from a landowner who's trying to deny that they did so, when they came down and in what circumstances, and so on and so forth. So I think there probably is quite an interesting, he says, as a lawyer rubbing his hands, probably quite an interesting kind of satellite area of litigation dealing with when exactly these works of environmental degradation, to coin a phrase, were done. Again, if either of you guys have any views about that, or if I've missed a provision in the Act, then jump in. But I think it's a very interesting one to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. Emmaline, any last thoughts before I wrap up?
Nothing from me. Thanks. Really interesting questions. Thank you, everyone.
Super. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, very much for attending. Before you go, I should just mention that there's another event coming up next week on the 2nd of October about EV charging by 2030. Yet another event that there's going to be some interesting discussion about policy changes. That's being presented by Rob Williams, Ruchi Parekh, Ashley Bowes, and Rasheen Norton, who's coming on to help us with that, a Cornerstone climate event. You'd be very welcome to come along for that. As we said, we'll make the recording of this event available shortly. The slides will be available. We've got the questions, so we'll also see if we can provide some further answers and keep the discussion about that going. One final thing just to mention, that our planning day will take place in November. Have a look at our website, and my colleague Ryan Coley and I will be talking again about biodiversity net gain amongst other things. So we may have something a little bit more to update you then, but thank you all very much indeed for attending, and we look forward to seeing you again soon, either online or in person.